So this chapter is about cognitive functions. So when it comes to your ability to think, much of what is taking place in your brain is asymmetrical because your brain is divided into two parts, your left and right hemisphere, and each of those hemispheres has different functions. And those functions are controlled by the opposite side of the body in most cases. So the division of labor that takes place between the two hemispheres is known as brain lateralization. The corpus callosum, the anterior commissure, the hippocampal commissure, and a few other small commissures all play a role in the lateralization that takes place between both of your hemispheres. So the left hemisphere connects to all of your skin receptors and the muscles on the right side of your body, and vice versa. The only exception to that is the trunk and your facial muscles. The left side of the body is specialized for language development and comprehension. That's true for most people. But the right side's functions are a little more difficult to summarize as a whole. In the temporal cortex, the planum temporal is larger in the left side for 65% of people. And you can see that's that purple area on the left side. Then there's other small differences between the hemispheres that exist for other non-human species. For each hemisphere of your brain, input is going to come from the opposite half of the visual world. And in your visual field is going to consist of things that you can see at that moment. Light from the right half of the visual field shines in the left half of both of your retinas, and light from the left half of the visual fields shines on the right half of both of your retinas. So it's crisscrossed. The left half of the retina connects to your left hemisphere so that you see what's in the right, and vice versa. And half of the axons from each of your eyes cross to the opposite side of the brain via the optic chiasm. For your hearing ability, each ear is going to send information to both sides of the brain, and those brain areas compare that information from both of your ears. Because the corpus callosum divides the brain in half, if it's damaged, then the hemispheres will not be able to exchange information. And there's been a lot of people who've suffered from epilepsy who have had their corpus callosum severed to try to stop those seizures, and then that caused difficulty with the hemispheres communicating. There's other options besides cutting the. There's other options, including cutting the corpus callosum to restrict seizures from one hemisphere of the brain. But again, when that happens, it causes difficulty with communicating between the hemispheres. So here's an example to show you what it's like for somebody who's considered split brain. They've undergone surgery in their corpus callosum, and their intellect, their motivation is the same. They're still able to walk and talk, but when they use their hands independently, they use their hands independently in other ways, and they find things difficult. Like they cannot necessarily do what they need to do. They can't see what they need to see. You can see in picture B, that person can only see the word band and not hat band. So Sperry in 1974 said that there are some behavioral differences that also exist for people who are split brain. Because the left side of the brain is dominant for language, many people with split brains have difficulty naming objects that are viewed from the left visual field, as we just saw in that picture. Immediately after surgery, a person's brain hemispheres are often in conflict for split brain patients, and that conflict becomes more rare as time progresses. In 2000, it was proposed that the left brain is the interpreter, that it invents and defends explanations for actions. We do know that the left brain hemisphere is important for speech production. The right hemisphere can help you comprehend spatial relationships and see a big picture. And when it's damaged, a person can have difficulty perceiving the emotions of others, understanding humor and sarcasm, and speak in a monotone voice. If the left and right hemispheres are inactivated, they won't, the person will not be able to speak. And when the right hemisphere is inactivated, it can lead to the reoccurrence of negative emotions and feelings. So research on the hemisphere dominance can't be overemphasized. Oftentimes people will say, I'm left-brained or I'm right-brained, but the truth of the matter is that everybody uses both sides of their brains, and we need both parts of your brain to cooperate for you to be a fully functioning individual. When it comes to language and human language production, it's a complex process. In chimpanzees, language use is very different than it is in humans. Chimpanzees vocalize while they're breathing, whereas humans um, breathe out. Chimpanzees breathe in. They seldom use symbols, and their symbols lack productivity. Bonobos actually have a social order that resembles the interaction that takes place between humans. They, however, can understand more than they can say or produce. They can request items that aren't seen. They can make creative requests. And that might possibly be due to language training beginning early, and also they are able to learn through observation and imitation rather than formal training. So how complex it is not really known. For non-primates, they also display some aspects of spoken language. The African gray parrot shows greater ability for imitating sounds and using sounds. Dogs can also learn to respond to human words. So we know that there is some type of language comprehension in non-primates. So we know that language has evolved from a precursor found in other species. When it comes to human language development, it starts out with gestures, and a child will first start communicating by making gestures, and then they will start making sounds. And as their brain continues to develop, their language will become more specialized. People with a full-size brain have normal overall intelligence. They can show severe language deficits, and language can eventually depend on more than a large brain and overall intelligence. People with Williams syndrome have an intellectual disability but they have a skilled use of language. So research has shown us that Williams syndrome is caused by a deletion of genes from chromosome 7 and decreased gray matter in visual processing areas. So here's an example of a young woman with Williams syndrome and how she draws. And you can see this is supposed to be an elephant. And then you can also see her description of that elephant. And the description is much more complex than the drawing. So Noam Chomsky and Pinker propose that humans have a language acquisition device, kind of like a computer, a built-in mechanism that helps them acquire language. And that starts in childhood. Research tells us that there's a sensitive period for learning a language, and there's actually a critical period for being able to speak. How easy it is to learn a second language is going to depend on age. Adults can be better at memorizing vocabulary for a second language, but children will excel when it comes to pronouncing and learning unfamiliar aspects of grammar. There is not really a sharp cutoff that exists for second language acquisition, but research has shown that people who try to learn a language after 12 rarely gain fluency, and people who learn a language before 12 can usually be more fluent. Deaf children who begin sign language while younger learn much better than those who start later. So we've also learned some about brain damage and language, and we've learned that through Broca and Wernicke's areas. Broca's area is a part of the left frontal cortex, and when it's damaged, it can result in a language disability known as aphasia. So you can have Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, which is a language impairment. So Broca's aphasia is known as non-fluent aphasia. This has to do with impairment in language production. So a person with Broca's aphasia will understand what is said to them, but when they speak to others, they may be hard or it may be difficult to understand them. We know that many people who suffer from Broca's aphasia suffer from that due to a stroke or any type of brain damage that's happened in that area. So a person with Broca's aphasia may speak like, I'm doing fine, and instead of saying, I'm doing fine. So it can just be difficult to understand them, although they understand language. Wernicke's aphasia is known as fluent aphasia because Wernicke's area is actually located in the audio cortex. So it has to do with hearing something properly. This has to do with impaired language comprehension, but the ability to remember object names. This person can still speak smoothly and normally. However, their communication won't necessarily be on topic. So if somebody with Wernicke's aphasia was asked how they're doing, they may just go ahead talking about a totally different topic. So here's a chart from your textbook that kind of tells you a little bit of the difference between Broca and Wernicke's aphasia. Dyslexia is involved with the impairment of reading in a person with adequate vision, motivation, and cognitive skills. Dyslexia tends to occur more commonly in boys and has been linked to several identified genes. It occurs in all languages, but is most common in the English language. So many people believe the causes of dyslexia have to do with abnormalities in the left hemisphere. People with dyslexia might have parts of the right temporal cortex that are larger. They could also have problems with auditory memory and impaired eye movements. But of course, we know that the causes and the expression of dyslexia can be different for all people. People with dyslexia might have difficulty with ordering sounds, trading first consonants of two words, having abnormalities in attention. The mind brain problem tries to show the relationship that exists between the mind and the brain. Dualism is the belief that the mind and body are different substances that exist independently, two different places that exist without each other. Descartes proposed that the mind and brain interact at a single point in space, the pineal gland. Most philosophers and neuroscientists reject the idea of dualism because they know that the mind and brain have to have a relationship with each other and work together. Monism is the belief that the universe consists of only one substance. Materialism says that everything that exists is physical or material. Mentalism says only the mind really exists and the physical world could only exist if the mind were aware of it. And identity position says that mental processes and certain kinds of brain processes are the same in different terms. Researchers tend to adopt monism as the most reasonable working hypothesis of the mind-brain relationship. And when it comes to the difference between easy problems and hard problems, um, an easy explanation is the difference between being awake and being asleep, and a hard mind brain problem what would be, why does consciousness exist at all? Consciousness is hard to define because it can't be observed, but it is generally thought of being awake, aware, and alert. Masking is a brief visual stimulus that's preceded and followed by longer interfering stimuli. Backward masking is a brief stimulus and final stimulus presented, and this is all to measure consciousness. These studies have shown us that consciousness of a stimulus depends on the amount and spread of brain activity. Binocular rivalry involves a slow and gradual shift of the eyes from one side to another. Stimuli that's seen in each eye will evoke a brain response. And switching to each stimulus is accompanied by a shift in a pattern of activity over a larger part of the brain. And you can see from the red and the green figure what binocular rivalry is about. If you look at the two circles through tubes, like a toilet paper roll or something like that, or touch your nose to the paper between the two parts of your left eye will see one pattern, while your right eye will see another pattern. And your eyes, your two views, are going to compete for your consciousness. So your brain has to identify a stimulus as meaningful before you become conscious of it. Some research indicates that consciousness is a yes-no phenomenon. If a stimulus fails to reach that level, then a pattern will fade away and it won't be magnitude or extend over the brain. When it comes to the timing of consciousness, delays exist between an event and our consciousness of it, our awareness of it. The thigh phenomenon occurs when we see a dot in one position that alternates with a similar dot nearby. When a person goes under anesthesia, they will lose consciousness. They will have decreased overall brain activity, decreased connections between the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia. And when a person is coming back to consciousness and the anesthesia is wearing off, then those areas will be reconnected and show increased activity. When a person is in a vegetative state, they will show less activity in the motor areas of the cortex, and those areas can be activated if magnetic stimulation occurs. When it comes to maintaining one's attention, attention is closely aligned with consciousness because it's your ability to be aware, awake, and alert. Unintentional blindness is change blindness. It's when if something complex is viewed in your visual fields and you blink your eyes, you can become unaware of it unless you're paying attention to it. Bottom-up processing of attention is reaction to a stimulus. A deer runs past you in the park, and that might grab your attention. Top-down processing is intentional. It's like when you look for a person you know in a group. Deliberate top-down processing depends on parts of the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex. Spatial neglect is our tendency to ignore the left side of the body and its surrounding, or the left side of objects. This might be due to damage in the right hemisphere of the brain and can be very pronounced after a person has experienced a stroke. People could also have problems associated with attention if they have spatial neglect. They might cross out all the letters that compose half of a word. So there have been several procedures that can increase attention on a person's neglected side. They could pay specific attention to that. They could look left when feeling an object. They could cross their hands in front of their bodies and completely even turn their bodies. So brain activity during decision making and social behavior are two new areas of research in neuroscience. When people make a factual decision, they weigh the evidence and their brain tries to process it. In research regarding perceptual decisions, a rat listened to a set of clicks and then turned his head in the direction with more clicks. So we know that the parietal cortex has two sets of cells that respond to the clicks on each side, and the prefrontal cortex, which is adjacent to the motor cortex, also has two sets of cells that keep score to know which side has more clicks. When it comes to decision making and values, most people's decision making based on their values are based on preferences. The basal ganglia learns which choice has the higher payoff and usually makes that choice for the person, helps the person make that choice. And then it might also do with rewards. When it comes to love, a study of how genes, chemicals, and brain areas contribute to social behavior is known as social neuroscience. This is a new area which expresses the difference or why people show love and why people show altruism. When a person is in love, certain areas of their brain are activated, and those, whenever a person is shown a picture of their loved ones, Their brain areas for memory and cognition are also active. So we know that love is a combination of motivations, emotions, memories, and cognitions. Oxytocin is a chemical that stimulates contractions of the uterus during childbirth, helps produce milk, promotes maternal behavior, social approaches, and bonding. We know that men and women release oxytocin during sexual activity, so it's known as the love hormone. There's been a lot of research on oxytocin through nasal sprays and men viewing photos of their significant other and other people. They tended to rate their significant other more higher than others when given oxytocin, but it didn't decrease their ratings for others. It just magnified their ratings for the people they loved. Oxytocin can also affect social relationships. It can help increase conformity of opinions of the in group. It seems to increase trust between in groups, but not out groups. It also can increase a person's attention to possible dangers and heighten reactions to threats from strangers. So, the hypothesis is that oxytocin increases our attention to social cues. When it comes to expressing empathy and helping others, empathy is related to our willingness to help. Altruism occurs when people are generous to others. We know this happens for evolutionary reasons, especially when it comes to family members helping each other out. Some people give more empathy to others. It might be based on societal expectations or culture and upbringing. The frontotemporal dementia occurs when damage involves the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex, which are involved in the rewards and other people's emotional expression. People with frontotemporal dementia won't recognize and respond to the reactions of others, so they're not going to show empathy. They would be more likely to kill one person so that they could save five people. They really don't care how others perceive them, and they don't show embarrassment because those areas of their brain are just not activated the way they could be.